All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Um, this is our department's fourth Head Talks. And for anyone who isn't familiar with the format, today's grand rounds is going to consist of four rapid fire talks that are given by residents and fellows in our department. These talks are patterned after the well known TED Talks format, and they were piloted by Dr. DeBonis, who started it. So we're excited to continue the tradition. These talks really have two main goals. The first goal is that we're incredibly proud of our trainees and we wanted to take some time to allow them to step into the spotlight. And second, we know that many of the most exciting, innovative, and interesting ideas will come from the people just entering the field, and we hope to introduce some of those ideas today. Each presentation is going to be limited to 10 minutes, so these talks are not meant to be a comprehensive overview of any particular subject. They're instead meant to pique your interest and give you a launching point from which to further explore the topic on your own. With these two goals in mind, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm proud to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Justin Key. I had the privilege of first getting to know Dr. Key while he was still a medical student, and I remember at that time being struck by his inquisitiveness and creativity. And now that I've had the chance to work with him in residency as well, these attributes have only grown more apparent. In addition to being a first-rate psychiatrist, Dr. Key is also a published science fiction author whose works have appeared in places such as the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, Cross Genres, and Kaiso Flash. Even during residency, he's continued to write and publish. Dr. Key's remarkable ability to navigate both of these worlds concurrently has strengthened his skills in each. He's used his medical training to inform his writing, and today he'll be talking about how the power of story and narrative allows him to bring a unique perspective to psychiatry. So please join me in giving Dr. Key a warm welcome as he kicks off Head Talks.
Thank you, Dr. Help. So, I met a young boy named Corey a few years ago while working in Seattle. He came urging me to tell his story, and I obliged. So over the next several nights, I learned everything I could about him. I learned about his family. I learned about some of the trauma he had endured. I learned about the death of his older brother. I even knew his favorite color and favorite food. And that's because I made him up. He was one of the characters in one of my stories. And through his journey, I learned a lot about narrative. And then as I would go on to become a psychiatrist, I realized he taught me a lot about psychiatry too. So I would like to share a little bit of his story with you. So this is an excerpt from a short story in 2015 about Corey. Corey, you can't say stuff like that, Mother said. Everyone had gone home. Smoke hung in the apartment. Mother wiped her eyes with the back of the hand holding a brown drink and loud ice. Why not? He asked. You just can't. You miss Michael. We all miss Michael. No, I don't. He's better dead. Mother held up a hand and put it to her face. She began to sob. Her tears smelled like the glass she held. He was a good kid, she said. I'm sorry, Corey said. So I made a full short story and I shared it with others. They enjoyed it, but as I started to listen to their impressions, I thought that something wasn't quite right. They thought, for example, that his older brother was irredeemable, just an evil abuser. They thought that they were a result of bad parenting. They also thought that Corey hated his brother and had no remorse for him being dead. And I felt like the narrative needed a change. So 4 years later, I did a lot of revisions, and this is what the passage looked like then. Why not? He asked. You just can't. That boy Patrick's mom called and said you made him cry. Cry. It's already hard for you to make friends as it is. This is why. She stopped herself, shook her head, sipped her drink, and sat back. Corey heard the words all the same. This is why Dad left. This is why Mike left. I'm alone because of you. I killed him, Corey said to an abandoned ash smudge playing card on the carpet. Oh, baby, I'm so sorry you have to go through this. Corey pulled away from her hug. You miss Mike, Mom said. We all miss Mike. I wanted him dead, Corey said. It's better now. Mom held up a hand, then put it to her face. She began to sob. Her tears smelled like the glass she held. He was a good kid, she said. I'm sorry. As a writer, It's my responsibility to give justice to my character's narrative and story, to make sure that their actions make sense with their past, to make sure that you can empathize with them, that you can love them, that you can hate them. And it's not because I want you to think that I'm a good writer or that I just want you to enjoy the story. It's because I realize that every character I write represents somebody's story out there. And I need to put in the time to make sure that I give that story justice. And I don't always get it right the first time. Take Corey, for example. When I first met him, I thought he had killed an abusive older brother. And as I learned more about him, I learned that he was struggling with two emotions: a deep love and sorrow for his brother who had died by suicide, and also a relief that his abuser was gone. Have you ever had a patient walk into your office and from the first time you saw them, you had them pegged? You knew what their story was, you knew what their prognosis was. I'm not saying you didn't want to treat them. I'm not saying that you didn't give them good care and you wanted the best for them. Certainly, when I first met Corey, I wanted to make sure that I told his story in the best way. But I also needed to be open to how that journey can change. And granted, as a writer, I create my characters from the ground up. But even though a patient comes to us after life, biology, and society has already created their story, it is our responsibility to listen to that narrative and repack that narrative. And not only tell it to them, but tell it effectively to ourselves, to other providers, to society. And think about the power of that narrative. Think about how a patient's understanding of their illness can affect how they take care of themselves, which affects their prognosis, can affect the care that they receive, can affect how society views them. I'm not saying you have to get it 100% right the first time. That's impossible. Or 100% right ever. That's impossible, even with made up characters like Corey. But if we can recognize the importance of narrative and the importance of always being able to change, we can do our patients more justice. And my argument is that we can't do it alone. So I want you to come back with me a few years ago, halfway through medical school. I just finished step one, which means that I simultaneously knew a whole lot and knew nothing at all. So naturally, I needed a break. So I went up to Seattle and I spent 6 weeks in an old sorority house with 17 other writers. And our goal was to create one new short story every week and to read all the other 17 short stories and critique them. And then by the end of the 6 weeks, we would have 17 other writers in our heads. So that every time we sat down at a computer, we weren't alone. We had somebody to urge us on and to also nudge us when we inevitably got a little lazy and didn't put enough effort into giving our character stories the justice they deserve. I had classmates who were transgender. I had classmates who were victims and survivors of sexual and physical abuse. I had classmates who had grown up in third world countries and this was their first time in America. And I had classmates who had grown up with a lot more privilege than I did. So by the end of that 6 weeks, I learned how to write the other. And I went on, finished medical school, become a doctor, and become a psychiatrist. And I realized quickly that as a provider, I treat the other every day. And to exemplify this, I want you to go forward with me a little bit in time. So I was on call at the VA about half a year ago, and I got this page. Now, if you've been on call at the VA in the last few years, you recognize this page. So basically, this was the story. This young guy, about 30 years old, drug addict, had been picked up by the police and on a warrant. And on the way to the jail, he told them, I swallowed fentanyl. So they brought him to the ED. He wasn't even a veteran. And then he endorsed SI. So they told me this guy's definitely malingering. Can you come? Can you clear him so we can get him where he needs to be so that we can get him to jail? So he already had a narrative presented to me. And I was ready to accept that narrative. But I went down. And the first thing that I noticed was he had fresh cuts on both of his arms. And when I talked to him, I realized that he was in one of the lowest points of his life. So I called his mom. And when I called her, she thought I was calling to tell her that her son was dead because her son had just recently divulged to her that her late ex-husband had sexually abused him as a child. And he couldn't live with the pain anymore. So I went back to the call room, and I was alone at the VA. But I thought of some of the co-residents that I admire, and how would they conceptualize this? What would they do? Would I make them proud with my decisions? And I called Dr. Yang, who was attending on call, and we talked for about 2 hours on and off about this patient, and recreated his narrative and decided that he didn't need to be in jail. He needed to get psychiatric care. And we were able to do that for him and delay jail just a little bit. Unfortunately, a few months later, he did pass away. And I was able to call his mom, and I was able to let her know that even though her son had suffered a lot in his last few months, that the love she had for him was apparent and brought him some comfort, I think, in his last few days. And I think with that, I was able to at least change the narrative for him, at least in her eyes, a little bit. And I hope that that brought her some comfort. So narrative, it's a powerful tool. It can also be a powerful weapon. And I think that being cognizant of that and also being cognizant of how we can utilize other providers and other diverse thinking and backgrounds to forward that narrative, we can do a lot for our patients. So Corey will be in magazine Strange Horizons later in early 2020. I still have some edits to do, but even when he goes out into the world, his narrative isn't over. I'm going to listen to how people take in the story, what they felt like I got right, what they felt like I got wrong, so that I can not only do better a narrative of a character like him in the future, but I can also do better with my patient's narrative. And residency is such a great place, a unique place, because we're forced to take the narratives that we create for patients and show them to someone else and say, hey, what's your perspective on this? What did I get wrong? What did I get right? And I don't think that that needs to stop in residency. Even the most senior psychiatrist here can benefit from going to other providers and going to people that fill in the gaps they have and saying, hey, did I get this right? What do you think? And I think that if we can continue to being open to being wrong and to changing our perspective, the more we can be champion for our patients and bring their stories to life. Thank you.
Next, I'm going to invite up Dr. Joel Braslow to introduce Dr. Gregory Gabrellas.
Hi, I'm actually really excited to introduce Greg, primarily because one of the first times I met him, and I think it might have been our first meeting, I was really excited because when we were talking, it turned out that we had been reading the same philosophers and social scientists that led us to psychiatry. He had read, as I did before becoming a psychiatrist, a lot of Freud, a lot of Marx, and then a huge amount of literature on what are called Freudo-Marxists, all the way from Bettelheim to Joel Covell. And so it surprised me, and that there was another resident who had come from sort of this similar intellectual tradition, and that led him to psychiatry in the same ways that led me to psychiatry. Greg's education reflects his deep commitment to trying to make sense out of how the social world intersects with the psychological world and psychiatric illness. He was an undergrad at the University of Chicago and majored in anthropology, and then did a master's in social science, and then went to medical school at Drexel and graduated in 2017. Since he's been here, he's been doing his terrific job of working with the Center for Social Medicine, bringing together seminars and organizing a number of sometimes controversial, but in a really good way, I think, at the intersection of psychoanalysis and social science. And so we've been supporting that, and it's been really great to do that. I think Greg is part of a new cohort of residents. It's really exciting for me, at least, that accepts psychiatry as, from my perspective, that it's both is rooted in the social sciences as much as the biological sciences. And I think his talk will reflect that. So, Greg, looking forward to hearing it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bresler, for your remarks, and to Dr. Helt also for organizing the session for us. All right, so as you can maybe tell from the title of my talk, it's not the most cheerful. So I'll start with the bad news. All right. So Americans are dying more rapidly and living shorter lives, erasing years of efforts on the part of public health workers to ameliorate racial health disparities. Dr. Stephen Wolf and Heidi Shoemaker, in their recent special communication in the Journal of the American Medical Association, argued that the average American's health is becoming increasingly unfavorable compared to population health in other parts of the world. The rising suicide rate, they found, is just one of the causes of death thought to contribute to declining life expectancy. They show that it is numerically overshadowed by deaths attributable to drug overdose, alcoholic liver disease, and particularly for women, heart and lung diseases. Although suicide forms just one part of explaining the recent trend of declining life expectancy, for psychiatrists, suicide is one of our most salient indicators about bad outcomes, significant not only for our patients, but also for their families, communities, and us, the mental health clinicians. Despite increased attention and commitment on the part of many mental health institutions to the need for suicide risk evaluation and prevention, a growing body of research on vital statistics has consistently demonstrated that the American suicide rate has been increasing for decades. For example, in a recent report by the National Center for Health Statistics, researchers found that from 1999 to 2017, the age-adjusted suicide rate increased 33%. The greater annual percentage increases occurred after 2006, corresponding roughly to the Great Recession. The crisis that these data suggest does not spare young people. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in people aged 10 to 34-year-olds, while being the 10th leading cause of death overall. The suicide rate is rising not only in the elderly, but also in young people, particularly those under 34 and as young as 10. Hence, as a population, we're not just shaving off months from people already nearing the end of their natural lifespans. We're facing increased mortality among young and middle-aged people across all racial groups, affecting those who would otherwise be contributing to work or family life. Physicians are therefore understandably concerned to know what to look for to determine whether our patients are at high risk of suicide. As a profession, we value our role in suicide prevention as a matter of protecting our patients' lives, in addition to public health. Psychiatrists use knowledge on individual suicide risk factors on a routine basis, such as in determining whether involuntary hospitalization is medically justified or in prescribing psychotropic medications. For example, it's well established that the risk factors that predispose individuals to suicide are old age, military service, recent discharge from a psychiatric hospital. Yet, as helpful as these risk factors are in formulating an individual's overall risk, they typically fail to predict any individual suicide. We can liken it to walking into a minefield, where to know the bombs are out there is one thing, but not having a clue on where to detect them exactly is something else. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, of course, has already found insufficient evidence to support routine screening for suicide risk. But even considered as part of our psychiatric practice, the practical effect of attempting to calculate suicide risk from known risk factors remains unclear. A 2017 review in the British Medical Journal found that when clinicians use suicide risk assessments to inform clinical decision-making, not only was there little to no consensus on how to actually perform these assessments across the board, but also limited evidence on whether or not they worked at all. The reviewers concluded that the overwhelming majority of individuals deemed at high risk would not die by suicide, and that about half of suicides would occur among individuals considered low risk at the time that assessments were being performed. So we have then a puzzle. How could the effects of rising suicide rates be so big as to affect our national life expectancy, but so unpredictable as to foil mass detection? This is only a seeming paradox, however, because understanding individual risk factors is not the same as understanding why suicide happens. But for us to understand this phenomenon more, we need to go beyond conventional medicine to look at it from the perspective of the sociologist. Epidemiology has long studied the relationship between social conditions and disease outbreaks. The pathologist Rudolf Virchow wrote in the 19th century that medicine is a social science and that physicians were the natural attorneys of the poor. In their seminal article, Social Conditions as Fundamental Causes of Disease, Bruce Link and Joe Phelan argue that focusing on risk factors in an individual obscures how illnesses are caused and spread, given a specific social organization, and in particular, social inequalities. They show how risk factors place the emphasis on the individual rather than one's context and unequal social conditions faced by individuals within a population. For example, why are some individuals more prone to experiencing risk factors to begin with? Can addressing individual risk factors be successful if the social conditions that power them are left untouched? By highlighting in this way individual social context, we can see that listing an individual's risk factors may give a false sense of certainty when the phenomenon that needs to be explained in suicide is not perhaps individual at all, but a problem facing all of us so far as we belong to a society. Since its publication in 1897, Emil Durkheim's Suicide, a Study in Sociology, has influenced researchers and physicians interested in understanding suicide as a social phenomenon. Durkheim was a philosopher who studied social statistics, believing they helped to analyze the structure of our society. His study remains a classic of social science taught to students and offers a social explanation not of why any individual dies by suicide, but what determines the suicide rate of a given society. What scandalized people when it was published is the recognition that something so private as the decision to end one's own life has its explanation not primarily in the mind, but in the organization of social life. Durkheim believed that physicians erred in reasoning from individual cases, believing that one could identify risk factors on a case-by-case basis that would add up to an explanation of the social trends. Reversing the commonly held opinion, he thought that our society collectively determines how many will die by suicide, and what appeared to be left to accident to him was ultimately who performed the act. Central to Durkheim's argument was that mental illness alone does not explain the suicide rate. To demonstrate his point, he compared suicide rates across Western European nations and showed that they did not correspond to the rates of serious mental illness, so far as that was being established at the time. His point of departure, observing the variation in national suicide rates, remains intriguing, particularly in light of how those rates are currently changing. Durkheim settles on the definition that the term suicide is applied to all causes of death resulting directly or indirectly from a positive or negative act of the victim himself, which he knows will produce the result. His definition does not require intention to die. Despite the difficulty this places on his research and perhaps questionable usefulness as a clinical definition, Durkheim believed that suicide must be thought of as an intelligible action related to normal behavior in mental life, pathological by degree, but not by kind. From his wider definition, Durkheim found it useful to describe social types of suicide. And of the four that he described, I'd like to briefly introduce one because it helpfully illustrates how social conditions, which we might be able to relate to in our society, can contribute to a significant population health outcome if we consider it as a social phenomenon. One of Durkheim's central conclusions was that suicide varies inversely with the degree of integration of the social groups of which the individual forms a part. He based his conclusion on demonstrating that suicide rates were inversely proportional to the degree of integration found in religious groups, families, and national politics. In his discussion, Durkheim wrote that there were currents of depression and disillusionment emanating from no particular individual, but expressing society's state of disintegration. He went on, however individualized a man may be, there is always something collective remaining, the very depression and melancholy resulting from the same exaggerated individualism. He affects communion through sadness when he no longer has anything else with which to achieve it. The incidents of private life, which seem the direct inspiration of suicide and are considered its determining causes, are in reality only incidental causes. The individual yields to the slightest shock of circumstance because the state of society has made him a ready prey to suicide. The last links on the chain of causes that determine the suicide rate then are social, whatever the individual predispositions may be. Solidarity for Durkheim was a characteristic of social structures and institutions, which penetrated deeply into individuals' minds and kept us working and living together. However, he saw that the structures of modern life were not conducive to sustaining solidarity, and the result was collective sadness and suicide. Analyses like Durkheim suggest that social reforms beyond mental health care will be needed to seriously confront the challenge that the alarming suicide rate presents and resulting decreased life expectancy as it's continuing. We should be cautious about making inferences about the kinds of changes we need from the proximate circumstances associated with suicide. Certainly, growing evidence that significant social crises such as eviction or incarceration are causally related to suicide, and so we should target housing and prison reforms. The erosion of social solidarity is an important cause of suicide, one that works through many intermediate circumstances such as relationship difficulties or loss, discharge from prison or jail, or eviction. The continued interest in youth dependency on social media, is it a symptom of weakening interpersonal relationships? It may be nearly impossible to reverse this trend with public health interventions that attack the problem so far downstream, when the issue may relate more fundamentally to our social structure, which in the United States make necessities like housing and medicine an expensive commodity rather than a right. It does not seem a coincidence that's precisely within the working age population that the rising mortality has taken its toll when the social safety net is worn away. There's hope, however, to take these social analyses and turn them into public policy. Researchers recently published a report showing how increasing the minimum wage in some states lowered the suicide rate. The rising suicide rate should sound an alarm. Just as with global climate change, its effects are insidious, but over time have a significant effect on our mortality. It's far more than an opportunity for psychiatric intervention, although psychiatrists can be helpful to the public by pointing out how increasing social solidarity through public programs is not just about cost, it's also about saving lives. A rising suicide rate can be interpreted as a measure of our collective sadness, a crisis that calls for changing our unhappy whole. Thank you.
Next, I'm going to invite up Dr. Katrina DeBonis to introduce Dr. Alpna Agrawal.
It is my pleasure to introduce you to the next speaker, Dr. Alpna Agrawal. Dr. Agrawal has accomplished an impressive amount with many letters after her name to show for it. In addition to her medical degree, she holds a master's in public health as well as a PhD in maternal and child health. She has consulted to the World Health Organization, written in statements to the United Nations, and has published many papers on gender, pregnancy, and health outcomes. Dr. Agrawal thinks deeply about the problems she sees in the world and seeks to find answers and solutions. She has added a tremendous amount to our resident community, serving this year as the chief resident of the Asylum Clinic, and has developed and implemented multiple lectures on physician wellness. I am looking forward to learning more from her today with all of you on the topic of gender, power, and mental health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Agrawal.
Hello, my name is Alpna Agrawal. I'm a fourth-year psychiatry resident, and the title of my talk is You Are a Gentle Person and a Scholar, Explorations in Gender, Power, and Mental Health. My mentor for this talk was Dr. Katrina DeBonis. Growing up, when my father was happy about something I was doing, he would say in the moment to me, gleefully, "Oh, honey, you are a gentle person and a scholar," and would impulsively kiss me on the head. For those of you who know the original saying, it is, "You are a gentleman and a scholar." But my father's own unconscious desire to treat his children equally led him to change the wording. Later, I realized how empowering this phrase was for me, how it embodied the way my parents did not conform to raising my sisters and I according to traditional gender norms. It differs from this line from a well-intentioned father growing into his role, my husband, who said to our younger daughter the other day, "Oh, Asha, you look pretty today." Of course, I looked over at him, gave him the stink eye, and we exchanged words. But it led me to how I wanted to frame this talk. When my husband chose to focus on our daughter's appearance, unknowingly and innocently, it caused me to reflect on the imperceptible ways gender roles manifest in our families and our daily work. I describe these personal examples because we are at a time in our culture where we are acutely aware of women not only being objectified, but harassed, subjected to violence, essentially dehumanized in our own country across socioeconomic class. We are at an important moment in considering the impact of these gender dynamics on mental health. Therefore, the purpose of this talk is to, yes, explore gender differences in mental health. but also to explore how gender-based power impacts mental health. We have long known about this persistent demographic finding in the US and globally that women get sick and men die. With respect to mental health, we can hypothesize how gender differences in mental health may propagate this finding. Depression and anxiety, which are more prevalent among women, are associated with higher rates of disability and chronic medical issues. Men who are more likely to die by suicide contributes to their higher rates of mortality. But what shapes these differences? What is the underlying cause? Well, let us consider what we have learned in the field of HIV about how gender drives disease spread through the concept gender-based power. In the HIV literature, gender-based power is described according to three major constructs that shape gendered relationships: the sexual division of labor, the sexual division of power, and social norms. HIV researchers have used this framework to identify risk factors that increase women's susceptibility to HIV, such as women's high rate of unemployment, women's experience of partner violence, and women's belief in conservative gender norms. They have not only mapped these indicators on each domain of gender-based power as shown here, but linked them to mediating variables, such as behavioral risk factors, illustrating empirically that these gender-based power imbalances increase women's likelihood of engaging in unsafe sex, for example, thereby increasing their risk for HIV. This kind of research has helped drive the development of interventions in the HIV field that go beyond providing condoms to communities to identifying root causes related to gender that drive disease spread. So why does this matter to those of us in mental health in the US? Because social movements such as Me Too, sexual assault on college campuses, and research in our field suggests that gender-based power and its manifestations, such as caregiver fatigue, violence against women, violence against women, and women's low status, is associated with the development of mental health disorders such as depression. That said, we are still elucidating the pathways by which gender-based power impacts mental health, as has been done in the HIV field. Continuing to examine these pathways with this framework in mind, though, may better inform effective interventions in our practices, healthcare systems, and communities. And then, what about men? Can we apply the gender-based framework to understand mental health among men? In popular media, terms such as toxic masculinity are being used to capture men's gendered experience. A survey of American men found that 35% believed violence begot respect, and 60% reported needing to fight back when pushed. Studies show that men ascribing to traditional gender norms, such as these, are more likely to report substance use. We are also observing men's increased involvement in childcare and finding that men engaging in this role reversal are more likely to report depressive symptoms. Similar to women, the details of these pathways are still being fully elucidated. While research is growing on men's mental health, gender scripts that describe men as needing to be strong, independent, self-reliant are being countered in popular culture, particularly in the arena of mental health. World-class athletes who are often viewed as paragons of masculinity are coming forward and discussing their challenges with mental health. This is Marty Fish, who left professional tennis due to debilitating anxiety disorder when ranked 7th in the world. He said, "To show weakness, we're told in so many words, is to deserve shame, but I am here to show weakness, and I am not ashamed." Research is also shedding light on the potential impact of men's socialization over the life course on their mental health. In the Hidden Brain podcast, How American Masculinity Creates Lonely Men, a developmental psychologist, Niobe Way, interviewed hundreds of boys capturing their changing relationships during adolescence. This is an audio clip from a boy in early adolescence.
My best friend and I love each other. That's it. You have this thing that is so deep it's within you. You can't explain it. It's just a thing that, that person is that person. And that's all that should be important in our friendship. I guess in life, sometimes, two people can really, really understand each other and really have a trust, respect, and love for each other. It just happens.
And this is an audio clip from a boy in later adolescence.
My friendship with my best friend is fading, but I'm saying it's still there. So it's still there because we still do stuff together, but only once in a while. It's sad because he lives only 1 block away from me, and I get to do stuff with him less than I get to do stuff for people who are way further. So it's like a DJ used his crossfader and started fading it slowly and slowly, and now I'm like halfway through the crossfade.
These vignettes illustrate how when coming of age, boys are socialized to be less relational, more isolated, potentially impacting their mental health. Apart from needing to build a deeper understanding of gender-based power in mental health as it relates to men, an ongoing gap in the field is capturing the experiences of other gender and sexual identities, which so far we know experience higher rates of violence, stigma, and discrimination. How might our framework on gender-based power enrich and influence our ability to improve mental health among these groups? As for next steps, let us go back to my personal example. First, I encourage each of us to reflect on what it means to have thoughtful dialogues with our loved ones about expectations of various gender roles. Next, I encourage us to think about the imperceptible ways we can impact gender-based power in our work in much the same way my father's saying imperceptibly empowered me. To this end, I want to propose calls to action on multiple levels for ourselves, our health system, and our community. My call to action for ourselves as mental health providers is to think about our own gender stereotyping and to be responsive to patients a part of subpopulations and in periods in the life course particularly vulnerable to gender-based power imbalances. Subpopulations such as veterans and sexual and gender minorities, periods in the life course such as during adolescence and during pregnancy. My call to action for our healthcare system is to think beyond social determinants of health screening focused on economic insecurity, but including gender-based power measures such as partner violence. And beyond screening, I encourage our healthcare system to integrate discussions of gender-based power into current programs, covering themes such as men's intimacy, relationship communication, and women's roles of caring. My call to action for our community is to go beyond gender blind and gender accommodating interventions and implement gender transformative interventions in mental health that actively change gender norms and address power inequities in partnership with communities. Thank you for your attention, and special thanks to Dr. DeBonis for her unwavering guidance and support through this year, to Dr. Castillo, who has been a steady mentor to me and insightful at all points, And thanks to Dr. Helt for creating the clinician educator track where I formulated this talk. Thanks.
And finally, I'd like to introduce or bring up Dr. Ben Schneider to introduce Dr. Emily Wood.
Good morning. It is really my honor to introduce Dr. Emily Wood. I've been allotted only 1 minute to do that, so I'll read about a 16th of your CV. Just a few salient highlights. She graduated magna cum laude from, with distinction from the University of Washington, an MD and a PhD in neuroscience from Johns Hopkins University. She was awarded the NIMH Outstanding Resident Award, which is awarded to only 12 people per year, as well as the Fellows Award for Research Excellence from the NIH. But on a personal level, we really should all have colleagues as intellectually curious as Dr. Wood. I remember the first time she rotated on my service, I think we were talking about the finer points of social skills training, and she turned to me and said, "I think you're wrong about that." And she was right. I was saying it wrong. But she is just the right mix of excitement in a supervisor. She asks these amazing questions, and terror. I don't know the answer to all of these questions. But this mix of keen intellect and unvarnished curiosity, I'm convinced, are the core tenets of her success, and certainly the reasons why I'll continue to watch her career over the next many years. Without further ado, Dr. Wood.
All right, only one more to go, guys. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. So in the practice of psychiatry, empathy is our versatile multi-tool for building rapport with the patient and making a diagnosis. Psychiatrists use empathic listening and transference to understand how patients experience and make sense of themselves and the world around them. Yet our most difficult and treatment-resistant patients often appear to reject all our attempts at empathic attunement, leaving us feeling rebuffed. Through a better understanding of the neuroscience and neurodevelopment of empathy, I propose that we can recognize and more effectively treat a subset of these patients who have alterations in the systems that underlie empathy, specifically mirror neurons and mentalization. I will describe a patient you may recognize. Julia is a 19-year-old female who lives with her parents in West LA and attends Santa Monica College. Her parents have brought her to me for an evaluation, describing worsening episodes of severe emotional dysregulation. These stress-related episodes have unpredictable, often trivial triggers, such as classmates responding slowly to texts about a group project, can result in household damage, and have a dissociative quality. Afterward, she appears disconnected from her agitated self and cannot describe the feelings and motivations she just experienced. Julian's parents say, "It's like we're walking on eggshells." She snaps at them when the television is too loud or her schoolwork is disrupted. If her parents do not make the same bland dish each evening, she doesn't eat a daily meal. She has manipulated her parents' empathy in service of meeting her needs. My attempts to validate her emotions through empathic listening and reflection are uniformly dismissed. "It's not like that," she says. Although Julia will not articulate how she truly feels. She appears help-rejecting with closed body language and poor eye contact. She seems to shut down emotionally, speaking in short, clipped phrases in monotone with little affect. Since high school, Julia has been isolating at home. She struggles to establish a social routine and yearns for a friend group. She says, "It's like everyone else was given a script for how to do this, and I didn't get one." She simultaneously fears that strangers are watching her and that she's invisible to the people around her. She reports poor sleep, constant fatigue, really low self-esteem, and thoughts of ending her life because no one understands her. She says that the only helpful coping skills are the bad ones, like cutting herself and banging her head. When asked to describe her feelings, she says, "Terrible," or "I don't know, very uncomfortable." In conceiving of a differential for Julia, most of us would consider depression, bipolar type 2, borderline personality, social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, OCD, OCPD, ADHD, maybe even ODD. But could impairments in empathy systems be a more parsimonious explanation for Julia's presentation? In the early 90s, the Rizzolatti lab first reported on neurons in the F5 region of macaque cortex, which changed their firing process, both when certain goal-directed activities were performed and when those same activities were observed being done by the scientists. These neurons came to be known as mirror neurons. Since that time, many researchers have studied mirror neurons in non-human primates and have found corresponding parts of the human brain with similar activation properties. These neurons facilitate sensory motor integration in a way that allows for imitation behaviors and may be the basis for perceiving the actions of others. We have a limited understanding about why we have mirror neurons. Certain animals may have a genetic predisposition to develop these specialized cells because they were adapted to fill a particular function, to understand the actions of others. It could also be that our brain is good at associative learning, and mirror neurons arise naturally out of this process. At the neuronal level, this is the Hebbian maxim: what fires together wires together. At the behavioral level, it is classical conditioning. Since the human infant is so helpless, her primary job is getting others to meet her needs. She has biological and psychological mechanisms on her side. The oxytocin released in her mother with nursing makes mother feel calm and bonded to baby. When baby cries because she is wet, hungry, or tired, mother is compelled to fix the problem and comfort baby. You must be hungry. I can fix that. Mother reflects baby's emotion with a congruent, attuned response that helps baby learn to label her own feelings and then modulate her own responses. Baby learns distress tolerance by the iterative process of having her needs seen and responded to. The mirror neuron system likely plays a role in the ability of mother to match her infant's mental state and demonstrate an appropriate response. Likewise, infant is developing her own mind via associative learning. Typically overlooked as a component of empathy is the sensory motor experience. For the iterative process of complementary mimicry to result in effective emotion regulation, the child and caregiver must have similar sensory and motor processing. Also, the child must have adequate social attention, and the caregiver must provide a relatively congruent representation of the child's feeling state so that the child does not internalize a false or alien self. There's one condition that we neglected to put on the differential. Some people with autism may not have a mirror neuron system that functions like the normal population. They experience altered sensory processing, and their salience network does not orient them to social stimuli like neurotypical individuals. These differences may either be the result of mirror neuron dysfunction or the cause of it. In either case, the functional consequences for people with autism can be profound. Julia was a colicky baby who seemed difficult to soothe. She rarely played with toys in the way the design intended, even after being shown. During Mommy and Me music sessions, Julia would hold her hands over her ears and refuse to join in. She also refused to wear anything scratchy and went for a period when she would not leave the house without at least one layer of tight, stretchy clothing. At the playground, Julie would recruit other kids to join in on her scripted imaginative play. Her parents saw her as independent because she didn't periodically check in with them like the other preschoolers. In fact, when she fell down and skinned her knee, she would keep right on going. On the other hand, if her routine was disrupted, she could go into a tailspin. Julia demonstrated multiple sensory abnormalities, including over-responsivity to noise and certain skin sensations, sensory seeking for body pressure, and under-responsivity to tissue injury. When young Julia cried, her parents were often unable to empathize and offer congruent, modulated responses because they were not experiencing the world as she was. Had we been able to measure the amount of time that baby Julia gazed at faces and responded to or made bids for joint attention, we would have seen that it was much less than the neurotypical population. So when Julia's parents appropriately labeled her distress, she often failed to attend to and internalize their responses of validation and fulfillment. When she fell down, Her parents ran to her with surprised and pained expressions of empathy on their face to kiss her boo-boos and make everything all better. But this response was incongruent with her desire to keep playing, so she did not experience an emotion being labeled and modulated. In elementary school, Julia would occasionally refuse to do an assignment, shut down, and leave the classroom. Her parents described her as stubborn and having selective attention. They noticed that she did not usually respond to her name being called if she was engaged. They would have to get in her line of sight or tap her on the shoulder to get her attention. So in third grade, Julia was diagnosed with ADHD and stimulants were started, which was helpful. Around that time, Julia's parents started to think of her as socially immature. Julia did not facilitate long-term relationships, and she wanted her friends to have common interests with her. Julia is inflexible with social rules and perseverates on fairness. Likewise, she believes everyone has certain unalienable rights, and she dreams of being a surgeon and working for Doctors Without Borders so she can bring proper healthcare to people all over the world. Through middle school, the gap between Julia's social skills and her peers widened. Her advanced logical reasoning far outpaced her poor capacity to describe and handle her own emotions. Theory of mind, or mentalizing, is the ability to understand actions by both other people and oneself in terms of thoughts, feelings, wishes, and desires. We believe this may be facilitated by mirror neurons. Julia cognitively understands the golden rule and approaches such rules both seriously and concretely. When prompted to consider what someone else might be feeling or wanting, she makes some good inferences. But Julia does not automatically consider the intent, desires, or emotions of people around her. She is not mirroring them. Instead, she uses the social behavior rules that she has learned over the years. As the social interactions of peers became exponentially more complex, she could not keep up. Nonetheless, her high IQ and social drive allowed her to pass until the structure of school fell away. Julia is now 19 years old, and I am diagnosing her with autism spectrum disorder for the first time. Even though autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that was influencing her life from day one, the diagnosis has only come to light because it is now dramatically affecting her functionality. Autism is a parsimonious diagnosis for Julia. She displays deficits in nonverbal social communication, and she struggles with social emotional reciprocity. Her severe social anxiety is best explained by her difficulty interpreting the social emotional behaviors and overtures of others. Julia also exhibits rigidity, inflexible adherence to established rules and routines, and sensory processing abnormalities. Julia is alexithymic. She is unable to label her distress, which often results in emotional dysregulation. Working with Julia can be difficult because I cannot trust my automatic mirroring and mentalization systems to correctly identify her emotions and drives. In order to empathize with her and build rapport, I have to completely recalibrate my multi-tool. Fortunately, as with our neurotypical patients, when a connection is made, both patient and psychiatrists are rewarded. When your best attempts at attunement are being repelled, that is a time to reflect on your empathic assumptions and question your clinical assessment. Underlying your patient's behavior may be a neurodevelopmental issue for which appropriate interventions could be life-changing. As the care provider, you likely have the highest functioning empathy systems in the relationship, and you are tasked with making your best attempt to understand the patient. Thank you so much for your time.
So, what a wonderful morning. It's, it strikes me just off the top of my head that this is a fascinating paradigm of what we're experiencing as a society now, because as an immigrant, America is much more individualistically driven than most cultures that you will run into. And so if you think of it, we only have a a tract of individual liberties. We don't have a tract of social responsibilities, yes. This is not something unique to me, having observed that. In fact, I think it was Roosevelt who wanted to create some better understanding of social dynamics for the better good of the whole country. Never worked. But when you look at these wonderful presentations this morning, they all are around that theme of the relationship between the development of an individual identity and the way in which that is framed either to propose and nurture a social identity or whether it actually blocks it out. And if we go backwards, the story of the autistic spectrum child, beautifully presented, is one where the individualism is not really capable of developing the usual adaptive engagement with others. And so it's misrepresented all the way through until somebody, as Emily, comes and says, no, there's a barrier here to the usual empathic understanding. The other fascinating thing, if you think about it, is the first three talks are all about the way in which we bring to our society a prejudice about how we rear children. Did you know, for example, that America is one of the only countries in the world where there is not, in the civilized world anyway, and probably in other parts of the world that we do pejoratively not call civilized, they have engagement with the attachments of children, but we have not socially franchised the idea that individuals can spend months or a year with their child or children in order to help that developmental program, which is the mirroring and then the trust and then the development of the independence, which becomes so essential in terms of the way in which you grow up, such as the father saying, you are a gentle person and a scholar. So this is really, and then you bring it back to the stories which you have to make in your own agenda, in your own evolution as a psychiatrist. You have to realize that one has to realize, this is not my telling you what to do, this is one has to realize that all the time we are in fact working with these stories that people have brought to us, but they engage through our own understanding of the story, which means really that although Freud got a lot of things wrong, subjective investigation, so-called psychoanalytic technologies, is helpful for the psychiatrist to better understand the way in which we must relate to the people who bring in a very special way, because it's not easy to tell one's life story to another person one doesn't really know. So I think this is an extraordinary thing that you, Katrina, or whoever helped put it together, all of you, because it really provides the essence of what we are trying to learn together. You know, none of us has a specific control over these things, but I think that if we continue to have this dialogue, which the residents are now pushing forward in a way that I think is very constructive. You know, America for a while, it was, when I first came here, it was psychoanalytic. Everything was a strange variation of schizophrenia. And then everybody took a deep dive into biology, and now we've come back again to perhaps a more balanced view. But we're pushing against a social order that recognize individualism without recognizing the social determinants of individualism. And I think that's what I would take from the discussions that came up this morning. Very fine, and thank you so much, all of you who participated.